Writer's Read by LiTracey. Getting that book in children's hands.
Hi, I'm Tracey Grice and welcome to the Writer's Read podcast. One of the quotes that inspires me in my practice as a teacher, in fact it's the one that sits front and centre of my desk at school, is written by Nancy Atwell, an internationally acclaimed author, and she says that for students of every ability and background, it's the simple, miraculous act of reading a good book that turns them into readers. Because even for the least experienced, most reluctant reader, it's the one good book that changes everything. The job of adults who care about reading is to move heaven and earth to put that book into a child's hands. And that's why this podcast exists. On the Writer's Read podcast today, I'm talking to Melbourne-based author Hilary Rogers. As our reader in residence, Hilary will be sharing her reading life with us and reading from the first book in her Girltopia trilogy. Also, on each Writer's Read podcast, we have our Rebecca Recommends segment with children's literature guru Rebecca Bird. Rebecca will be sharing her insights on other titles written by Hilary. And now we're hearing from Hilary Rogers. She's a Melbourne-based writer and publisher. She's worked as a publishing director at Hardy Grant Egmont, and this is where Hilary created some of Australia's most beloved series for kids, including Billy B. Brown, Squishy Taylor, Go Girl and Zack Power. Many of her series went on to sell into the millions in Australia and New Zealand alone, as well as securing countless international deals around the globe. I had the privilege of being invited into Hilary's home to record this episode. In fact, we actually chatted for hours, well beyond our scheduled time for the recording. If it wasn't for the fact that we had a long drive back to Adelaide from Melbourne, I may still be sitting at her dining room table chatting. I'd like to send a big thanks to the team at Scholastic Australia for making this chat happen. Hilary, lovely to meet you. What are you going to read for us today?
So I'm going to read from the first chapter of Girltopia, which is the first book in the trilogy. We have just met Clara and we only know two things about her. We know that her parents have just split up and we know that she has a very active imagination. It was on the dot of 8:45 when Clara and her mum left the house. This was pretty much a miracle because it was her dad who always kept them running on time. He used to say it was like herding cats trying to get his girls out of the house in the mornings. Her parents always used to fight about Clara's mum being late for, everything. Maybe he wouldn't have left if Clara had been more helpful in the mornings. See? Her mum raised her eyebrows at Clara as she checked the time on her phone. Who needs men? Clara looked at her mum with horror. Did she honestly just say that? Are you happy Dad's left? Her mum looked suddenly old and sad. Of course I'm not, she sighed. It's just, I do think we'll all be better off in the end. We just need to get used to the new setup. Mum, said Clara firmly, I don't want to talk about this right now, okay? Clara stomped next door to get Sam while her mum hunted around in her bag for her lipstick. Clara and Sam walked to school together every day. Sam was in year 5 and totally in love with her. She pretended she didn't notice. Anyway, no sane year 6er would crush on a year 5 boy. Clara had pressed Sam's doorbell twice already, but there was no sign of Sam or his dad. She tried again. Maybe he's already left, called her mum from the footpath, as if Sam would walk to school without her. But then again, she couldn't hear anything from inside. She replied, walking away from Sam's door. Want me to walk with you, honey? Asked her mum. Nah, I'll be fine, said Clara. Your test tubes need you at work. Clara's mum was a doctor, but she spent most of her time in a lab at the hospital, testing things and mixing things and looking at things through a microscope. Clara still felt cranky and sad, but she and her mum had a deal that they never parted on bad terms. For her mum, it was probably just one of those mum things. For Clara, it was in case she was abducted by aliens during school time, or a tsunami swept through and she never saw her mum again. You do have to be careful about these things. So she kissed her mum goodbye on the cheek and hitched up her backpack. School was only a few blocks away, and she might be short, but she was a fast walker without Sam and all his questions. Clara stopped at the zebra crossing just across from school and looked around. Where was Soapy? Soapy had been the lollipop man for as long as anyone could remember. Before that, about a century ago, he'd been a famous football player. It made Clara feel bad that a famous footballer could end up just helping kids get across the road. Not that playing football was very interesting either. There weren't many cars around, so Clara crossed on the road on her own. She raced in through the school gates and over to where she and her friends always sat. But her heart sank when she saw Sienna sitting with the others. Arabella was in the middle of telling a story when Clara arrived. "Quick," she said to Clara, "I'm just getting to the good bit." Clara squeezed in between Lola M and Lola R and leant forwards. Arabella always had good stories to tell, but they were usually only half true. Clara liked trying to figure out which bits were true and which bits were made up. "So," Arabella said importantly to Clara, "I was just telling Sienna and the Lolas that I woke up, got dressed, had breakfast with Mum and then cleaned my teeth, all in like 15 minutes. She looked at Clara, eyebrows up. "That's pretty fast," said Clara slowly, wondering when the story was going to get interesting. It wasn't like her bestie to tell such a boring story. "Darling, it's not fast, it's impossible." Arabella looked at Clara as though she was being dumb. "I have 3 brothers, remember? 3 smelly, greedy and annoying brothers." Arabella was always moaning about her brothers, but Clara knew how much Arabella loved them. She'd always been jealous of Arabella's big, loud family. "Charlie takes forever to do his hair," Arabella reminded Clara. "Tom always finishes the milk but puts the empty container back in the fridge so no one knows we need more. Will is usually wandering around in his undies looking for clean socks, or even dirty ones." "Gross," nodded Lola M. "So everyone was being good this morning?" "Well, if you call staying in bed and refusing to wake up good, then yes," said Arabella, sitting back on her heels like she'd just told them all the punchline. "Your brothers all pulled sickies on the same day?" asked Lola M, rolling her eyes. "How stupid do they think your mum and dad are?" Lola R had a strange look on her face. "What is it?" Clara asked her. "You look funny." "I feel funny," Lola R said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Luke did the same thing this morning." She paused. "And so did Dad." "Get out of here," said Arabella, her eyes wide. "Maybe there's something wrong with all the boys." "It's probably nothing," said Lola M. She was always the sensible one. But Lola M was an only child of 2 mums. There were no boys at her place anyway, unless her donor dad was visiting. The bell rang, but the girls just looked at each other without moving. "Mr. Jackman will know if there's anything going on," Sienna said. She loved Mr. Jackman even more than the others did. "If Mr. Jackman is here," said Arabella dramatically. The girls laughed as they ran across the playground. It seemed like a funny thing to say at the time. They didn't even notice there wasn't a single boy in the playground.
Okay, everyone, by now you should know the drill. If you want to find out what happens next, you need to get this book in your hands. The great thing about this book being part of a trilogy is that you don't have to wait too long to find out what happens next. The next Girltopia book is hitting the bookshelves as we speak. So make sure you get to your local library or bookshop to get reading Girltopia.
Students Speak.
This book is about a girl called Clara who wakes up and finds all the boys and men in the city asleep. She has to work with her friends to find out why. I gave this book 3 lives. The first live is for the mystery. I love the suspense in this book. It is also a series, so the resolution doesn't get set at the end. It'll get set in the next few books. The second live is for the humour. The humour doesn't make you laugh out loud, but it adds spice to the book. The final live is for how real the book is. I think a lot of girls my age would be able to relate to Clara, who is the main character in this book.
Rebecca recommends.
Listening to this podcast, you are either ready to head out and read Girltopia after hearing Hilary read from it, or you have already read Girltopia. You'll be hanging out to find out what happens next. Well, Boss Girl is book 2, but be warned, you may not find out all of the answers in this one. After all, there is still one more book to come. So we left Clara at the end of the first book after she, Arabella and Izzy planned the escape from Melbourne to rescue her dad and his friend. They'd not been affected by the virus because they weren't in the city at the time of the outbreak. Her dad didn't come back into Melbourne with her, so he hasn't been affected by the virus either. He's okay. The other man got the virus as soon as he entered the city. but Jack did not. So in Boss Girl, we see Clara is being heralded as a hero. She is the face of Girltopia, which the city is now being called across the globe. Clara is not completely comfortable with this new image. She's always been about doing the right thing, and it just seems that lately it is not so easy to figure out what the right thing is. As we know from book 1, Clara's mum is one of the scientists working on finding a cure, but something isn't sitting right with Clara. Her mum seems to be keeping things from her, and Clara has no idea what or why. Her suspicions become more aroused when she receives an anonymous text message saying that there is another boy who hasn't been infected, and the message also says that she should go to level 7 of her mum's lab to find out more. Now, there are a few weird things about this message. 1. How do they know there is even one boy, Jack, who isn't infected? 2. How did they get Clara's number? And 3. How do they know where Clara's mum works? Well, maybe that one's not so weird, because as I said, Clara is the new face of Girltopia. Everyone seems to know stuff about her. So Clara does manage to sneak her way onto the 7th floor. It is very quiet there. It is dimly lit, and Clara does catch sight of a kid that may or may not be a boy. She can't be sure, so there are no answers there. There are other strange things happening too. Like one day Clara receives a really cool hoodie, green and pink polka dots, with a note saying, "For the girl who started it all." She also gets a mysterious party delivery. After looking everywhere in town for balloons for a 5-year-old's birthday party and not finding balloons anywhere, she receives a box of fancy balloons, green and pink balloons. Who is behind the mysterious gifts? Could it be anything to do with the mysterious girl hoods who Clara is just hearing about? Their uniform seems to be anything green and pink. And what about the graffiti that keeps appearing, featuring a girl in a hoodie? So many questions. What can I tell you? Well, we may find out a bit about the girl hoods, who they are and why they think that the virus may actually have been created on purpose. We may also find out about who is being kept on level 7 and who is keeping them there. And did I mention that Clara is hiding someone in her attic? Well, you might find out about that too. That's a lot of stuff happening in a book that doesn't quite finish the story. Now we just have to wait for book 3, which I'm sorry to say I don't have a date for yet, but I'm sure it's not too far away. Now for something completely different. Meet the Fruities, a new series that Hilary is writing with Josh Leffers, author of the very cool Hectic Electric series, and the illustrations are by Pete Petrovic. There are 3 books in the series so far: Bad Apple, Crazy Kiwi, and most recently, Punky Pineapple. Punky Pineapple is, as his name suggests, a pineapple. He looks tough and crazy and prickly. Some of the other Fruities are scared of Punky Pineapple, but the truth is, Punky is a real softie. So, when Missy Starfruit goes missing at a movie premiere where Punky is her bodyguard, he is the first suspect. After all, he looks like a punk, and punks usually cause trouble. But he is the good guy, and it's his job to find her and save the day. He'll just need a little bit of help doing it. So who will he choose? Crazy Kiwi, Banana Dog, Bad Apple, Little Chili, Sour Lemon, the Cherry Twins, or Peachy Bandit? I'm not going to tell you who he chooses. Where's the fun in that? I will tell you that this foursome, yes, he chooses 3 friends, become the Fruity Detectives, and their mission to find missing Missy Starfruit takes them on an adventure involving an electric waterfall, the bottom drawer, and the Freezy Freezer. Just when you think that the book is finished, there's an extra treat at the back. It's a 2-page comic, The Fruit Digest, giving you some behind-the-scenes exclusive. And this one ends in a pretty disgusting way, which readers will love. This is a series for newly independent readers. Each page is highly illustrated with 2 colour illustrations and a small amount of text on each page. To give you a comparison as to what they look like, think The Bad Guys, Weirdo, and Ella's Secret Scribbles. And a lot of books at this level are seen as boys' books, such as the D-Bot Squad or Weirdo, or girls' books like Ella's Secret Scribbles or Pearl the Unicorn. Not that there's anything wrong with these series, but the Fruities are completely gender neutral. They are fun, silly, and utterly heartwarming stories about the fruit, living in a fruit bowl. Girls and boys alike will find the ridiculousness of these books extremely appealing, and the adults that may have to read them might get a laugh too.
Hi, my name is Hilary Rogers, and you're listening to the Writers Read podcast.
When I was chatting with Scholastic and they talked about the opportunity of meeting up with Hilary Rogers, I was really excited. So when we went to Melbourne on a family holiday, it was great to be invited into Hilary's home and to meet her family and to have a chat about her reading life. And I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you now. So great to meet you today, Hilary, and thank you for having us here. I've been reading this great book by Anne Bogle called I'd Rather Be Reading, and it's all about the delights and dilemmas of having a reading life. So she talks about, all of the things that make us a reader and all the strengths and struggles we have as readers. And I guess for this podcast today, I really want to thank Anne for the inspiration in forming some of the questions. So in her book, Anne talks about the coming of age as a reader, and she believes it's a real truism that early reading shapes the reader you become. So I was wondering, what are your earliest memories of reading in your childhood?
It's funny you ask that, because there's a very specific moment from my childhood where I remember thinking, just feeling that sort of inner spark that a book gives you. I was having a very old book. It's out of print now, but I have tracked down a copy. Very old book called The Porcelain Man being read to me. It's a very strange picture book in blue, pale blue and brown. It would never get published now. Quite odd illustrations. And it was about a girl who had grown pale from too much obedience. And the idea that you might grow pale from too much obedience was just the most transfixing idea. And I just remember thinking, I was quite a naughty kid, so I was never going to grow, and I had olive skin, so I was never going to grow pale from too much obedience, that's for sure. But I just remember thinking that was an amazing idea, and it was enchanting, and it also sort of gave me permission, that being too good might not actually be good for me. So maybe it was okay to be naughty. And I feel that really was a moment that, it's always nice to be snuggled up with mum or dad and getting that special focus. I was the youngest of 3 kids, so there was always chaos, and we're always sort of jostling to be... to have the attention. And when you're having a book read to you that's enchanting you like that, and you've got that one-on-one relationship with a grown-up, I feel like that set me on a path of realising that these are very special moments, and they need to be recast in different phases of your life, and you become obviously an independent reader, and then as a parent or a teacher or a publisher you go on to read to others. But I feel that moment, that idea of growing pale from too much obedience, was probably that pivotal moment for me.
So how did that then translate into those, those beginning years of school where you're starting to, you're still being read to, but you are starting to take on the role of reading text yourself? Do you feel like that really set you up to be a reader through your school years?
Yeah, I think it did. I think it meant that I always knew there was magic inside those covers. And so even when reading, I can still remember that feeling when reading was a bit overwhelming, and you'd turn a page and there'd be that sea of text and not enough illustrations, particularly growing up in the 80s. And you had to work really hard until you got to one of those precious illustrations where you could pause. So I do remember feeling a little bit overwhelmed by that, but knowing that it was something worth fighting for. And I think I was always very keen to read, but... And reading wasn't necessarily difficult for me, but I was a terrible, terrible speller. And I can always remember, mum and dad would get these reports. It's, Hilary's reading is fantastic, but what is going on with her spelling? Maybe she should be reading more. And mum and dad would just be sort of, she couldn't really read much more than she already does. Something was just not clicking between the reading and the writing. So there were definitely those sorts of challenges, but I credit those challenges with going on to become an editor, because that was a difficult process for me. I had to kind of really fight for it, and I think that made it all the more magical.
So that feeling of being overwhelmed is something that I think a lot of children face as they're learning to read and as they're learning to choose text. Often they're flicking through the book looking for the one that's got lots of illustrations. So how did you navigate that? How did you, did you have a role model? Did you have some guidance? How did you get yourself through that feeling of being overwhelmed by too much text?
It's such a fascinating question, because I don't think I really did have a role model. I did grow up in a family where books were important, but I'm definitely the most bookish of the family. And I grew up in England. I had my primary schooling in the UK, And I don't recall there being a strong push for that. I think it was always something that just felt it was worth persevering through. But interestingly, in later years as a publisher, it's something that I've been very conscious of, and I've really always tried to keep a hold of both the art and the science of a book. The art being just that magical sense that you just want to keep reading for some reason, and you want to be in that person's head and that person's world. But the science in terms of who is the most likely reader and what stage will they be at and what can I do to help them turn those pages. So I often think as a publisher of this sort of mix of illustration, narration and dialogue, and try and really almost build the story a third. Because I do remember that feeling as a kid where I'd sort of skip through all the adjectives and, all the sort of descriptors and try and get to something happening or someone saying something. I was always very drawn to dialogue as a child. And I think most kids probably are. I don't think that's particularly unusual. So I feel like I kind of worked quite hard as a child to work my way through that, but I'm trying to make those stories. I think the challenges for kids are ever greater to be reading. The distractions are more shiny and omniscient. So I do feel like we need, as publishers and writers, to work really hard to sort of think about how we can help those pages be turning, because if the pages are turning, then something really special is happening.
Absolutely. And part of that, getting kids reading and getting those pages turning is the ability for children to choose books that they can and want to read. And the research is really overwhelming in that respect. But often what we see in schools is that children are told, you're reading from this level, and of course there's a place for level text, or everybody in the class is reading the same, class novel, for example. So there's all kinds of debates around these issues. But we know that choice is a highly motivating factor for any of us. So if you fast forward in your life as a reader, perhaps once you'd finished school, and perhaps I'm not sure what school life was like for you in terms of choice, but when you had to navigate that territory of, okay, now I can read whatever I want, how did you manage that?
Such a good question, and I could talk forever about levelling, age ranging, because it's something that most Australian publishers have really, really resisted. Certainly in the UK, there's been age ranging. If you turn to the back of a book, you'll see the age range, and it's something that I struggle. Even with Girltopia, I've had extensive conversations with my wonderful publishers, Scholastic, because I felt very strongly that Girltopia was 9+. They wanted it to be 11+. We felt that we would put that guidance there. But I think if a kid is gravitating towards a book, I'm really keen for them to read it, because I think on the whole, kids do self-censor. My experience watching other children read is that they just simply don't absorb the things that they're not ready for.
Absolutely.
And if they do, then, and they want to talk about it, then, your job is to be there. But in terms of my own choices as a reader, I do find that fascinating. I'd like to think that I would defy all algorithms. If there was an algorithm trying to figure out what Hilary's going to read next, I have this vanity that nobody would be able to pick it, because it does seem, even to me, quite strange. I noticed, for example, over the summer, we've just had, it's the end of the summer while we're chatting now, and that's a very special reading time for me. During the year when we're all working and the kids are at school and things are very busy, reading has to happen in snatches here and there, and it's often work related because I work in publishing and I write books. But over the summer, it's this very special time where my brain is my own and my choices are my own. And I find that fascinating, because I'm trying to slow down after a year of busy work, and my brain is on high speed. It's still kind of whizzing around. And I think this is something that most kids experience most of the time, because the stimulation and ideas that are around are just ever present and bombarding. And so I often find I have to work my way into, for me, the most special thing is a perfect fiction, a perfect novel. That's the wonderful thing for me. But I often find I need to go through some non-fiction to get there, because I can't quite slow down enough. So, for example, this summer I started reading the Monthly magazine, which I love and I always try and read. And that is the sort of perfect segue from a busy year and what's happening in the world and what's happening in Australia, and long-form, beautiful thoughts. So I sort of go through that, and then I sort of start thinking, okay, now I need to read something that's just going to force me to keep turning the pages. So this summer, I read my first Lee Child book. I've never read a Jack Reacher book. Everybody else in the world's been reading these books for years, obviously. And it's not really my style of book or writing. And I thought I need to understand what it is everyone's excited about. And it was the most perfect thing to read because I couldn't stop reading. I really had to neglect everybody around me and all sorts of other things because I just needed to keep reading. And so that did that thing to my brain that just kind of slows me down. And then I felt I could move on to perhaps, slightly more challenging material. So I do find it just depends on where my head is at. And that's the thing for me with reading, is that I know my brain needs it as a counterpoint to everything else that's happening in the world and in modern life. But I also know I can't just go from the manic, crazy, working kids, all sorts of stuff going on, straight into a really beautiful literary novel. I need to kind of step my way down. And so I love the idea. This is why in my publishing I've always tried to make all sorts of different books for all sorts of different kids, because I think any reading is actually fantastic, is a way of slowing down, of being away from a screen, of being away from your own mad racing thoughts or whatever it is that is happening in your life that may be wonderful or quite challenging. And obviously kids face all sorts of challenges in their lives. And I think any book that they can pick up, whether it's a licensed book, whether it's a comic, whether it's something really beautifully written, I don't really mind. I think as long as they're just having that reading experience, and then I think that's a really exhilarating moment to kind of step onto something that might be a bit more challenging.
For sure. And I think that's such an important message, because I guess one of the things I love about Anne Bogle's book is she talks about that dilemma and how important it is to talk about your reading life, because you have actually said how your brain over that summer period, how it rolls in terms of your reading, and you need to build up slowly by reading other kinds of texts before you get to sort of that meaty one. But I think what happens, particularly what I see in schools, is that children either put a lot of pressure on themselves to be reading something really big and thick, and whether it's about sort of looking the part or wanting to fit in, or whether it's other external pressures that are placed on the child, that they think a reading life is one that entails reading these really dense novels.
Important novels.
Yes.
I think that's something that we as the grown-ups around these kids, whether that's parents, teachers, librarians, publishers, really need to be aware of. I absolutely agree, because I think that's something that does need to be taken into account when you're thinking about cover design and even just the books that we press into children's hands. But I think it's really good to remember, I mean, we all read those trashy magazines when we're waiting at the dentist and get a certain pleasure from it. And then, sometimes we might read the Russian novels. And I think that is part of a kind of healthy reading life. Yeah. And so I think one of the things that I've often tried to do in my publishing is be aware that even if I'm doing something that's fairly accessible, so, take a series like Billy B. Brown that I did with Sally Rippon, or one of those sorts of really popular series that we crafted very carefully with a very particular kind of reader in mind, of course they will judge the book by the cover, so make it a really accessible, desirable cover. And that's almost a separate beast to what happens on the inside, because exactly, kids are going to look at what each other's reading and they're going to feel a certain sense of competitiveness or inadequacy, or just as we as adults do. We sort of read reviews or see all the books that our friends are reading and think, how are they managing their time better than me? How are they reading all these great books and getting smarter while I'm not? And I think that is something, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that books exist. They don't have their own separate category like maybe they do for adults. For children, they exist as part of everything else. It's in amongst film, online life, everything else that's going on, and books need to be as interesting and cool as that. I don't think it's going to work if we think that books are in an ivory tower and are very special and important and part of school achievements. I think I'd much rather kind of pull them out of that ivory tower and just place them in life. So the idea that you might watch that Netflix show or you might read that book, that's where reading, I think, is really triumphing, when it's actually competing with the other things, and it's not this kind of weird and difficult and special and important thing you need to do, like your times tables. I would love it to be a really accessible and fun part of kids' lives.
So in terms of accessible and fun for you now, in Australia, the school and working year is about to kick off, and you've now coming out of that nice summer sort of slide where you've done some reading that you've had some time and space to do. What's your reading life going to look like as you move forward back into work mode?
I think I always find in late Jan and Feb, I clutch on to the summer feeling. So I'm always doing more reading because I'm slightly in denial about the fact that I need to gear up and be a bit more focused. But I'm very much an in-bed at night reader. But during the summer, I'm on the couch reading at every given moment, and as I say, neglecting the kids and everything else that I'm supposed to be doing. So I imagine there's less and less on the couch reading and more at night, trying to wind down my brain reading. But one thing that's been really exciting is my son is about to go into year 8, and he is reading The Outsiders, S.E. Hinton, for school. And I thought, that's so exciting. What a fantastic excuse to reread. And I realised I'd never read Rumblefish.
Okay.
Or if I had, I've forgotten it. So Sid has read both of them, and we watched the film, the Rumblefish film, which is an extraordinary. Have you seen it?
I have not.
From the 70s. No. Extraordinary, strange, beautiful, beautiful piece of art. Really, really fantastic film, and worth tracking down a copy if you can find one. So I'm doing that thing. It's the perfect scenario where it's a wonderful book by an extraordinary writer, obviously, who's still alive. I didn't realise she was still alive.
No.
A fantastic film that's attached. So I'm doing a little bit of parenting, and there's a wonderful film, and I'm also reading a great book. So I think that's a really lovely start to my reading year for 2019.
For sure. And so is rereading then something that you have the opportunity to do, you relish doing, or is it just kind of you've got a stack of books, by that bedside table or a library where you're
yes,
through.
To all of that. It's definitely a guilty pleasure. Life does feel too short, and there are too many wonderful books to reread, but there are certain books that I find I need to reread. They're books that are very important to me but fall out of my brain in a particular kind of way, or I feel like I need to check back in on them every decade or so. And certainly Jane Eyre is one of those books that I tend to reread every 10 or 15 years, and Crime and Punishment, which is a grueling read in many ways because it's a very difficult but wonderful book. But there's not that many books that I reread from my adult reading life, but I absolutely love rereading the books that I adored as a child, because I find that a fascinating process. This year just gone, I reread the Narnia books, and that was an extraordinary experience to go through, thinking of C.S. Lewis as an adult and knowing what I knew about him and his own personal views, and rereading those books to my daughter was a fascinating experience. There was this moment that I remember very clearly because, of course, I don't think this is a spoiler, I think most of your listeners will be very familiar with the Narnia books, but when Aslan dies, I remember that in my childhood as just being this apocryphal moment where the most wonderful thing, the most wonderful character being in literary history could die. It was just devastating. I remember tears streaming down my face. I was a ready crier as a child. But I remember just being utterly, utterly devastated. And when I got to that moment when I was reading it with my daughter, who was 7 at the time, she said, "Oh, don't worry, Mum, Aslan won't really be dead." And she just knew that the author, she knew whether or not it was true, that the author wouldn't do that to her. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because I think in our day because there was less publishing directly for children, and often you move straight from kids' books to adult books because there wasn't young adult as a sort of genre back in the 80s and 90s. I don't think I would have had that confidence. I think I was so in the moment that I was convinced that Aslan had died and that Lucy would never recover from it. I would never recover from it. But I did think that was a really interesting moment, and maybe that's the advent of more careful children's publishing and Disney film. And, you know, she just felt that she was in good hands. Yeah. And, you know, and of course she was absolutely right. Or maybe she's just got a better sense of narrative and could feel that there were too many books left in the series for Aslan to actually have died. But I thought that was a very interesting moment.
Absolutely. So thinking about just, again, that idea of habits and our identity as a reader, sometimes we have secrets. I know that I do as a reader that I have not always had the confidence to share with my students. But when I do, and they hear that, sometimes my reading life's out of balance, you know, particularly during the year, as you set it up, I read a lot more nonfiction. I'm reading a lot more for my job to help me sort of, and the fiction slides a bit, and they're like, oh, you know, Mrs. Grice, she's not reading any novels at the moment. And it's one of those secrets that you think, you know, actually it does help children to go, oh, you know, I'm a bit like that too. And, you know, they feel relieved when you share some of these things with them. Do you have any secrets as a reader that you may or may not want to share?
I do have secrets, and I choose to share them with you.
Thank you.
And it's actually, these are genuine secrets. So I definitely went through a Mills and Boon phase. And I think it's hilarious when I look back on it, because I'm sure I was too young. I must have been 15, 16. And it was just this little phase. And I remember immediately thinking, okay, I've read too many of these really, really silly romance novels, and not everyone can be a cowboy, and everyone has chiseled jawlines and all that sort of rubbish. But it just, I think what it did for me, and I'm not recommending this necessarily at all, but what it did, what my, you know, fleeting Mills and Boon phase did, was it got me from my childhood reading, which was very acceptable and sanctioned by teachers, and I dipped my toe then in the fantastic Judy Blume, which felt very illicit. I don't know whether all the teachers and parents knew that we were all sharing those books or not, but we liked the idea that they didn't know. So they may well have just been, you know, complicit in the idea that we were secretly sharing these books that did feel very kind of exciting and you know, a bit kind of naughty. And it got me from my childhood reading into my adult reading. And as we all know, there is that spot, and I can see it. It's late primary, early high school, when kids are not having to read in quite the same way. Maybe the parents have sort of slacked off a little bit because, you know, their kids can read. Things become very busy. Kids are much more on social media. They're doing a lot of sport, other things, and your reading really can slip, and it can be very hard, particularly as a publisher, I know, to sort of figure out how to get to those kids and how to keep them. They're not wasting any of their pester power on books. It's on everything else. And I think if you can find anything that takes you from one phase of reading to the next, as I say, I'm not necessarily suggesting Mills and Boon, but that is, I think, what got me there. And I now do this thing when I go away in the summer holidays. At the beginning of the summer, I read a bit of nonfiction, as I said earlier. And I also read, we've got this little beach house that we share with the whole family, and there are people everywhere. And one of my very dear friends has been devoted to collecting the Sookie Stackhouse books, which are the True Blood series, those vampire books, which are also super, super trashy, but the pages just turn. And she's been buying every single one in an op shop. Each one's cost her $1.50 or $2. And I usually read a Sookie Stackhouse book, which if you knew me, you'd think it doesn't make any sense. It's really, I've never published a vampire book. I'm not particularly into paranormal romance. It's not the sort of thing that I would ever write. But I just love that feeling of getting completely out of my head and reading something that is completely irrelevant. Because if I'm reading something that's a little bit like something I might publish or I might write, a small part of my brain's thinking, good text design. I like those chapter heads. I wonder what stock this is on. Interesting choice with the cover. I wonder what the advance was. Look at the RRP. I start thinking about all of these work-related things. So reading paranormal romance just fleetingly, I would never do it during the year, but there are these sort of wonderful little moments. So yes, there are plenty of trashy reading secrets there that I've just shared with you. I am now going to have to kill you.
No, that's okay. It's interesting because in Anne's book, she says that books find their way to you when you need them, and it sounds like in those moments where perhaps you're not necessarily focused on the vampire story as such, but you're thinking about it, like you say, other work-related things, that it frees your brain up to do that kind of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is so relevant to what you were saying about children's reading habits earlier, because particularly if you're someone like you and I, we're surrounded by books, we are absolutely seeped in the knowledge that reading is one of the most important gifts we can give children, and that we ourselves have been given. It's hilarious to think a lot of my very dear friends would have no idea that I read trash. They would think everything I read is a Russian novel from the 19th century. And I just think that's so enchanting. And I actually do talk. I haven't told anyone about the Mills and Boon phase. I hadn't even thought of it until you asked that question. But I do think it's really important that we talk about all these different things.
Of course.
But I do also think within that, just to be a little bit more serious, I think there are things being written that perhaps aren't helpful. And I do think some of the, particularly for adults, but a lot of those sort of magazines that really fan the desires of comparison. I think this is something that tends to happen more online now than in print form. But all of the aspects that we surround ourselves with that tell us we should look a particular way or feel a particular way or act a particular way, I think those sorts of influences can be really difficult for kids to escape, much more so. They come home from school, but many of them still have the iPad. We've got the iPad program in Victoria that kicks in, iPad or laptop, depending on the school, kicks in grade 3. I don't know how that compares with other states, but
very similar.
Once you've got the iPad program, a kid can tell their parents they're doing homework. They may well be doing their homework, but they might not be.
Sure.
And I think it becomes increasingly difficult to escape the pressures of needing to look, think, feel, be a particular way. And so I think being able to get away from that and ensconce yourself in a book is just ever more precious.
So finally then, what advice would you give young listeners, or indeed adults who are listening and helping young people in their lives to find that book that either turns them into a reader or helps to keep the momentum going in their reading life? What advice would you give?
Yeah, look, I think it's really similar to what you were saying earlier, that choice is so important. I would love it if the trip to the local bookshop or the local library, of course I say bookshop because as a publisher I like books to be bought, but I love the library system in Australia. It's so invaluable. But I think if a trip to a bookshelf of some sort, is a normal and ideally treasured part of family life and school life, then I think we're halfway there. The idea that you're in this section, this is the section that works for you, this is the middle grade section or the junior reader section or whatever it is, or this is the comic book section, whatever it is, you get a treat today and you can pick a book, whichever book you like, and I will buy it for you or borrow it for you or lend it to you. I think we're halfway there. If books feel like an important and wonderful part of life, and if you as an adult are reading, I mean, we all know that kids imitate adults, whether it's the teachers or parents, but it's easy to forget that in the busyness of life and to be sort of bustling around and on your phone and checking your emails while telling your children to do more reading. I think we all need to be spending less time on our phones, less time on our emails, on Instagram, whatever it is that you spend too much time on. We actually need to be leading with that. And if we're sitting there on the couch reading, then the kids are going to curl up. You know what they're like. They sort of gravitate towards you. So I think if you could cordon off a part of the day or a part of the weekend or a part of the week, whatever it is that's going on in your life, that is non-negotiable reading time, but you can read whatever you want. It can be about sport. It can be about music. It can be loads and loads of illustrations, but you have to read. There are no screens on and it's reading time. I think that would just be a really, really wonderful 2019.
Brilliant advice. Thank you for your time, Hilary.
Thanks so much, Tracey.
What an insightful look into such an interesting reading life. Hilary was so warm and generous with her time, and she made great coffee. If you like the sound of Hilary's books, we have one to give away. So make sure you like and share the link to this episode on our Facebook page to win a signed copy.
Tracey's tip.
In the teaching profession, we often hear about the importance of rereading. This may be in the context of helping students with greater fluency and comprehension of the text they read. As a result of this greater fluency and comprehension, children's confidence as a reader grows. We can also talk about the importance of rereading in the home environment when parents reread favourite texts with their children. This too is an important context for rereading. Sometimes parents can become tired of their child wanting their favourite book read over and over again. But I'm sure many of us can recall a favourite childhood story that was a precious bonding time with our parents and where that book became like an old friend. Sometimes children find it hard to find their next great read, so rereading old favourites provides the impetus for children to keep reading until they find new reading material. Often I hear teachers lament that their students are reading the same book or series over and over again, and that it's time for them to move on to something new. And it is to this point that I'd like to quote the scholar, novelist, and beloved author C.S. Lewis. He says, "It is a good rule after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between." This quote really got me thinking, as it's not a practice that I've tried as a reader, but one I think I'd like to try. When I reflect on the pace of reading a book for the first time, I often feel pressured to keep the pages turning as I engage with the unfolding plot and develop connections with the characters. But when I think about books that I have read again, as most of us know, we notice things we missed on the first read. Our reading pace slows, and because we know the scope of the story, we can pay close attention to the details. We discover attributes of characters missed on the first read, and the clues the author leaves throughout the text to weave the plot together. A reread allows us to view the book from fresh perspectives. Characters and situations look different in light of how we have grown and changed as individuals. The other great thing about rereading a book is that it's not a gamble. At some point in our lives, it has hit the mark. So when you're prioritising the to-be-read pile by your bedside table, or you're noticing a student repeatedly rereading the same book, consider the value of rereading and C.S. Lewis's resonating words, "I can't imagine a person really enjoying a book and reading it only once." To keep up to date with all of our latest episodes, make sure you subscribe to your preferred platform on the ozcastnetwork.com. And of course, follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Writers Read by LiTracey. On the next Writers Read podcast, we hear from Victorian-based author Fleur Ferris. She's going to read aloud from her latest young adult book, Found.
Writers Read by LiTracey. Getting that book in children's hands. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Writers Read by LiTracey, a Dave and the Beanstalk production.